Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. I still remember the moment I signed the papers. The house my parents always dreamed of was finally theirs. Or at least I thought it was. I worked for years, sacrificed my time, my energy, my social life, everything to afford this. I didn't do it for myself. I did it for them. I had always been the responsible one, the child who never asked for anything, who never made trouble, who always put the family first. I was their golden ticket, their safety net. And yet, from the moment my younger brother Daniel was born, it was clear he was the favorite. Daniel never worked a day in his life. While I juggled school and part-time jobs, he was allowed to stay home and find himself. He never had responsibilities, never faced consequences. My parents babied him, protected him from reality, and when he failed, because of course he failed, they would always say, "It's okay, he just needs more time." I never got that luxury. I had no bitterness about it. Not at first. I loved my family. That's why, when I finally made it, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. Give my parents the house they had always dreamed of. I spent months searching for the perfect home. A 2-story colonial-style house with a wraparound porch, a large backyard for family gatherings, and enough space for them to finally live comfortably. The day I handed them the keys, my mother's eyes filled with tears. My father clapped me on the back, saying, "You've always been a good son." For a fleeting moment I felt something rare, pride. But pride doesn't last forever. A few weeks later, I stopped by the house to drop off some documents for the final legal transfer. My mother greeted me with a warm smile, but something felt off. The house smelled different, as if it had already settled into someone else's routine. There were shoes by the entrance that didn't belong to my parents, and I noticed a pile of Daniel's clothes on the couch. "Is Daniel here?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Oh, he's moving in," my mother said casually, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. I frowned. "Moving in? Why?" My father, who had just walked into the room, chuckled. "Well, he's had a tough year. He needs a fresh start, and this house is the perfect place for him to get back on his feet." I felt my stomach tighten. "I thought this was your house." "It is," my mother said quickly. Too quickly. Then she gave me that soft, patronizing look she always did when she thought I was overreacting. "But we put it in Daniel's name. You already have your own place." "He doesn't." The room felt like it had tilted sideways. I stared at them, waiting for them to say something. Anything to make this make sense. "You put it in Daniel's name." My voice barely came out. My mother reached for my hand. "Sweetheart, he needs stability. You're doing so well for yourself. You're strong. Your brother, well, he's struggling. This is the least we could do for him." The words slammed into me like a punch to the gut. I had worked myself to the bone, sacrificed so much, only to find out that my parents had handed everything over to the one person who had never lifted a finger in his life. And yet, they spoke to me like I was being selfish for questioning it. I took a slow breath, pushing down the burning sensation in my chest. I didn't want to explode. I didn't want to say something I'd regret. So I simply said, "Okay." That was it. No arguments. No accusations. Just okay. They had no idea what was coming. I didn't argue. I didn't fight. I didn't even show them how much they had just shattered something inside me. Instead, I smiled. "Bae." That's all I said. And I could tell they were relieved. My father patted my back as if I had just accepted some noble sacrifice. My mother squeezed my hand, believing her words of, "Daniel needs this more than you," had convinced me. I left that day without another word. But I wasn't done. I drove back to my apartment, my mind racing through every moment in my life where I had been the afterthought, the one expected to just endure, to always be okay with whatever scraps I was thrown. Not this time. Because they had no idea that when I bought that house I did something smart. Something very smart. My parents thought they had transferred ownership to Daniel. They thought I had just handed them the house and walked away, expecting nothing in return. What they didn't know was that the house was never fully in their name. I had put a clause in the contract when I purchased it, A legal stipulation that stated that if the primary owners, my parents, ever transferred the house to a third party, Daniel, without my written consent, full ownership would automatically revert back to me. It was airtight, bulletproof, and they had no idea. So I waited. I let Daniel move in. I watched as he posted photos of himself in my house on social media, bragging about how he had finally landed on his feet. I watched as my parents basked in the glow of their sacrifice, telling friends and family how proud they were of giving Daniel a second chance, how he finally had a place to call his own. They had no idea that every second they spent living in that house was borrowed time. 2 months later, I made my move. I showed up unannounced, papers in hand. Daniel was on the couch, feet up, playing video games like he had no worries in the world. He barely looked up when I walked in. "Hey bro. What's up?" I glanced around. The place was a mess. Pizza boxes, dirty clothes, unwashed dishes everywhere. This was what he was doing with my sacrifice. I exhaled slowly, keeping my cool. "Hey Dan. Just needed to go over something real quick." I pulled out the contract. He barely glanced at it. "What's that?" "Just read it," I said, setting it on the table. He sighed, pausing his game to skim over the document. And then I saw it. The moment everything clicked. His lazy expression hardened. His eyes widened as he reread the clause, the one that legally revoked ownership of the house back to me. This can't be real." His voice cracked slightly. "It's real." His face paled. "Mom and Dad. I already spoke to my lawyer. They signed without reading the details. The house is mine again." For the first time, Daniel looked truly scared. Within an hour, my parents were there. My mother stormed in first, her face red with panic. My father followed closely behind, looking more confused than anything. "Why are you doing this?" my mother demanded, clutching my arm as if that would change things. "I didn't move. I gave you a gift. You took it and handed it to him. You never even thought about how that would feel." My father exhaled sharply. "We thought you'd understand." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I do understand now. I understand exactly where I stand in this family." I handed them the final notice, a legal eviction. They had 1 week to leave. Daniel screamed at me, my mother begged, my father pleaded, but I didn't budge. For the first time in my life, I put myself first. They had a house. They had my house. And they gave it away. Now, it was mine again. And I wasn't making the same mistake twice. The days that followed were an emotional storm. My phone rang non-stop. Calls from my mother, messages from my father, and increasingly desperate voicemails from Daniel. First, they were angry. My mother accused me of tearing the family apart. My father claimed I was being petty and vindictive. Daniel, as expected, called me selfish, cruel, and heartless. But I didn't respond. Because for the first time in my life, I realized something important. I wasn't their son, I was their safety net. And I was finally cutting them loose. A week later, I showed up to the house one last time. My parents were sitting on the couch, looking worn down, as if the weight of their decisions had finally caught up to them. Daniel wasn't there. I assumed he was off trying to find a new place to crash. My mother's eyes were red from crying. "We never meant to hurt you," she whispered. Exhaled. "No. But that doesn't change what you did." My father sighed. "We just thought Daniel needed it more." There it was again. That same excuse. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "And what about what I needed?" Silence. They had no answer. That was all I needed to hear. I handed them the final set of papers. A settlement agreement. Not for them but for me. They thought losing the house was bad. They had no idea what was coming next. Because I wasn't just reclaiming my house. I was selling it. My mother gasped as she read the documents. "You're selling it?" "Yes," I said simply. "I already have a buyer." Their faces drained of color. You can't do this," my father stammered. "Where will we go?" Shrugged. "That's not my problem anymore." For years I had been the one to fix things. The one to work harder, sacrifice more, give without asking for anything in return. But the moment I needed them to be decent, to be fair, to think of me for once, they failed. And now they were on their own. The night before the sale was finalized, Daniel showed up at my apartment. He was a mess, hair unkempt, dark circles under his eyes. "Man, you don't have to do this," he said, his voice raw. I messed up. Get it? But I have nowhere to go." I folded my arms. "Neither did I when you stole my house." He winced. "It wasn't like that. Wasn't it?" Silence. For the first time he had nothing to say. "You always had a safety net," I continued. "Mom and Dad. Me. Someone was always there to pick up the pieces." He swallowed hard. "I don't know how to do this alone." I held his gaze. "Then maybe it's time you learned." And I closed the door. The next day the sale was finalized. The house, the one I had sacrificed so much for, was no longer in my name. But this time I was okay with that. The new owner was a young couple expecting their first child. They were excited, grateful. They would love this house more than my family ever did. And I took my share of the sale and bought myself a new home. Not a house for someone else. Not a gift to be taken advantage of. Home. Just for me. For the first time in my life I was free. And I never looked back. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story and tell us where you're watching from.